Our second lesson comes from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 6, verse 6. Jesus is speaking. But whenever you pray, go into your room and shut the door, and pray to your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. The summer after I graduated from college, I spent several weeks traveling through Europe. Some friends had made similar plans, so we decided to travel together for part of the time, but I was clear I wanted to travel alone for at least a week. It seemed to me that being alone in a foreign country was an important experience to have as I embarked on adulthood. So after 2 weeks traveling through France and Italy with friends, I set off by myself for the town of Heidelberg, Germany. I got on a train and settled in with my book and my snacks. It was great to be alone. But soon, the train was slowed down by some bad weather and mechanical problems, and it arrived in Heidelberg hours after schedule. It was pitch dark and pouring rain. I had finished my books and my snacks hours before. Oh, and I didn't speak a word of German. I'd made a reservation in a hostel ahead of time, and somehow I figured out which bus to get on from the train station. Now keep in mind, this was before you could just pull out your smartphone and look up Google Maps or call an Uber. After riding the bus for several stops, I realized I had gotten on the right bus going in the wrong direction. So I got off at the next stop and stood there in the pouring rain as I waited and waited for the bus to come back. Finally, it did, but by the time I got to the hostel, I was a wet and miserable mess. So when the hostel owner answered the door, gave me a critical once-over, and told me, thankfully in English, that she had given my bed to someone else hours before, I couldn't help it. I burst into tears right there on her doorstep. "Please," I said, "I don't know where else to go." She took pity on me and gave me a sleeping bag and a pillow and let me sleep on the floor of one of the bedrooms. But I didn't get much sleep that night. I spent the whole night trying to figure out why on earth I thought it would be a good idea to spend a week traveling alone. That was when I discovered the difference between being alone and being existentially lonely. In last week's sermon, I shared the statistic that of all these hazards to our health, living with pollution or obesity, drinking too much alcohol, or suffering from chronic loneliness, it is loneliness that puts us in the greatest danger. We know loneliness is bad for human beings. That's why in prison, the worst punishment you can get is to be sent to the SHU, the solitary housing unit, otherwise known as solitary confinement. I recently heard interviews with prison inmates who had each spent years at a time in the SHU. One had spent 26 years there. And they made clear that such isolation takes a terrible toll. In the SHU, inmates can lose their grip on reality, lose their ability to communicate clearly, lose any sense of dignity. The true intent of isolation, one of those interviewed said, is to belittle you, demean you, dehumanize you, to make you less of a person than you are. And yet, all of these men who had spent so much time in solitary confinement also described something else, something that was an unintended consequence of this punishment. They described how their time in solitary confinement taught them things about themselves they couldn't imagine learning any other way. Things like what they really cared about, what mattered most, and the true value of human connection. In other words, this punishment meant to dehumanize them actually led them to a deeper sense of their humanity. Now, to be clear, I am not advocating for solitary confinement as an effective form of punishment. But these stories these men told about being forced to endure isolation for days, months, or years at a time is a reminder of both how ill-equipped most of us are at enduring any hint of loneliness, and that facing our loneliness can teach us something about ourselves. As a society, we have developed all kinds of distractions to keep us from having to really enter into solitude, not the least of which are these little devices we carry around, which can connect us to people all over the world in just seconds. I don't think that's a good thing. Most of us experience loneliness as bad, as something to be avoided at all costs. And if we have a way to avoid it, then we will. Yet at the very beginning of his ministry, right after he is baptized, what do the Gospels say that Jesus did? He spent 40 days in the desert, in the wilderness, completely alone. And alone in the desert, he first encounters not God, but Satan, tempting him with all kinds of ways he can escape the pain of his loneliness. Then later, when Jesus gives his followers advice about prayer, what does he say? Don't pray in front of others, where you'll be tempted to make it look like you've got it all together, that you don't really need God at all. Instead, pray in private, alone. Go into a room, close and lock the door, and maybe, just maybe, in your solitude and even in your loneliness, you'll find the courage to bring your true self before God. Jesus knows that loneliness and solitude are two sides of the same coin, and sometimes when we seek out one, we encounter the other. Jesus also knows that both loneliness and solitude have something to teach us about who we are, who God has made us to be, and it's something we can learn only by going toward solitude and loneliness, rather than avoiding them however we can. At the age of 12, Eugene Peterson decided to start reading the Bible for himself rather than just hearing it read in church. Someone suggested that he start with the book of Psalms, and he did, but he found the Psalms deeply confusing. He had grown up in a Christian tradition which taught that the Bible was to be read literally, every word as factually true. But in the Psalms, Peterson quickly encountered phrases like, God is my rock, and you put my tears in your bottle. Ideas that made no sense at all if taken literally. This, Peterson said, is how he learned what a metaphor is. But even more than teaching him about language, the Psalms taught Peterson what it looks like to show up before God as we are, not as we think we are supposed to be. Peterson now likes to say that the Psalms train us in honest prayer. The Psalms are prayers of individuals overcome with emotion. Sometimes these emotions are positive, joy, hope, passionate praise. But other times, like in Psalm 102, we overhear the prayer of an individual in the depths of despair, desolation, and isolation. We hear the prayer of one who is deeply, existentially lonely. I lie awake, the psalmist writes. I am like a lonely bird on a housetop. All day long, my enemies taunt me. This is the prayer of one who has nothing to hide. the honest prayer of someone willing to be utterly vulnerable before God. Maybe that's why Psalms like these are hard for us to hear, not just because it's hard for us to encounter the suffering of another human being, but because we recognize it. Who among us has not experienced at one time or another the feeling that we are truly alone? As a species, we are drawn to experiences that help us avoid loneliness. We create communities, both real and virtual. We form addictions to all kinds of behaviors that help us deal with difficult emotions. And we go to great lengths to show up at home, at work, at school, even at church, as the best versions of ourselves, regardless of whether that is the most honest version. But Jesus' advice to us about prayer suggests that from time to time, there is value in going toward the loneliness we try to avoid, even value in seeking it out. This is how Eugene Peterson translates Jesus' words in Matthew chapter 6, verse 6. Here's what I want you to do. Find a quiet, secluded place so you won't be tempted to role play before God. Just be there as simply and honestly as you can manage. The focus will shift from you to God, and you will begin to sense God's grace. One summer night, when he was 15 years old, Ian Crone and some of his friends decided it would be hilarious to run naked through the banquet room of an exclusive country club in their town of Greenwich, Connecticut. But Greenwich is a small town, and they knew someone would inevitably recognize them, a problem they solved by wearing ski masks to cover their faces. Around 9 p.m., they streaked through the wood-paneled dining room filled with bankers and heiresses. The men clapped and cheered while the women stood frozen in shock. The next morning, as Ian rummaged through the refrigerator, his mother casually asked, "What did you do last night?" "Not much," he answered, "just hung out with Mike and went to bed around midnight." Ian's usually chatty mother said nothing in response, which instantly gave him an uneasy feeling. "What did you and Dad do?" he asked. "We were guests of the Dorfmans at their golf club banquet," she said. Then she fixed him with a steely gaze. "A ski mask? A ski mask?" Putting her face right up next to his, she said, "I could pick your scrawny butt out of a lineup in the dark." We might think we are doing a great job of hiding our pain and our loneliness and our faults. And while we might succeed to some degree, at least, from hiding our less desirable parts from each other and even from ourselves, God is the one who made us and knows us intimately. If we think we can hide from God, we are fooling ourselves. Thomas Merton once wrote, "Sooner or later, we must distinguish between what we are not and what we are. We must accept the fact that we are not what we would like to be. We must cast off our false exterior self like the cheap and showy garment it is. We must find our real self in all its elemental poverty, but also in its very great and simple dignity, created to be a child of God and capable of loving with something of God's own sincerity and God's unselfishness." What we learn from the Bible, and especially from the honest prayers in the Psalms, is that there is value in following the loneliness that so repels us, even in seeking it out from time to time. When we do, we might just discover that solitude and even loneliness can lead to something quite profound, a better understanding of our true identity as children of a loving and gracious God, and a deeper connection with the God who created us and knows us completely, the God from whom we simply cannot hide. The prayer of the lonely is prayer without pretension. The prayer of the lonely is the prayer of the humble, who no longer has anything left to prove or to hide. The prayer of the lonely is prayer that happens when we quit trying to disguise ourselves or distract ourselves from the pain of the loneliness that exists deep within each one of us, when we embrace the courage to follow that loneliness and show up, dripping wet, dead tired, and not speaking the language, and beg God to take us in, trusting that God will. God always will. Amen.